All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to talk about what happens if Russia loses the war in Ukraine. This is not an assessment of how the war is currently going. In fact, I would argue that Russia likely has a lot of advantages right now over Ukraine as this war continues to drag on. More, I want to address this concern that if Russia were to lose, somehow the entire world would go up in flames. And it would be worse for everyone if Russia loses this war, because there's not really a lot to suggest that that would be the case. I mean, if you look through history, it turns out countries do lose wars all the time. Nuclear armed countries lose wars. We have lost wars here in the United States, and we seem to be doing, pretty good. It turns out what happens when a country loses a war, especially a war that they're fighting on someone else's territory, is that they adapt a little bit, suffer the consequences to a degree, and then just kind of continue on, not all that different than how they were before the war first kicked off. So why would it be so drastically different for Russia in Ukraine? And the fact is, it probably wouldn't. Russia would continue on much like they did prior to 2014. The world would not go up in flames. Now, looking at a couple of the key arguments here, we're going to dive into the fear of political instability, the fear of a collapse of the Russian Federation, and then the big one, can't avoid talking about this, the nuclear question. Wouldn't Russia just fire off a bunch of nukes if they were on the verge of losing in Ukraine, triggering a global war? No, probably not. Again, there's no real reason to think that that is in the cards at all. So starting out with the argument for political instability, which most certainly would happen, right? If Russia loses the war, and that provides some amount of context for people to push back against Putin, maybe overthrow the government, maybe try to install some sort of new leadership, that is likely to happen. Maybe not likely. That would set the stage for something like that to happen, right? But the thing is, we just don't have any control over that. We don't in the West. I mean, look at what we've done since this war kicked off. We imposed significant sanctions directly on Russia and multiple entities and individuals throughout Russia, and that just didn't really do much at all. So why is it that we think that through some, roundabout way, we could somehow influence how the political instability in Russia turns out 6 months, 18 months, 5 years from now? We haven't really been able to do that in the past, so that's going to be a thing. It's going to be a thing in Russia no matter what. Why would that be something that the United States and the West is concerned about? We have no influence over it, right? And Chatham House hit on a few of these fallacies that I wanted to dive into, and one of them here was talking about the political instability, where they said, quote, fetishizing a false stability in the hopes of modulating a political change whose contours inherently defy prediction vastly overplays the West's influence on Russia. Again, we just don't have the ability to direct Russia exactly how we want. So the concern that it would not end up exactly how we want, that's going to happen no matter what. It has the war in Ukraine doesn't really impact that at all. They continue by saying it is revealing that countries neighboring Russia, i.e. those most vulnerable to conquest and occupation, or with the most experience of Russian aggression, seem the least fearful of what may hypothetically happen inside the country. Their politicians and leaders are far more concerned with what Russia does today than with speculating about the future. And this is true. If you followed this war at all, some of the most hawkish countries related to supporting Ukraine and defeating Russia are right there on Russia's borders. They're not having the conversation of what could it be possibly worse if there's political instability inside of Russia after a Russian defeat. That conversation is not happening. They're focused on the here and now, and the here and now is Russian aggression pushing through Ukraine. That has to be stopped. The political instability, not even on their radar in the least. And of course, these are the countries where some sort of major political instability in the region would have a direct near-term impact. So maybe we need to take that into consideration, right? Prioritize the threats here, if you will. Political instability is not a good thing. It would certainly impact all of these things. It would certainly impact the markets, the global trade. A lot would be affected by any sort of political instability in a major country like Russia. We can't write that off entirely. But to suggest that that would somehow be a worse overall end state for the world than Russia invading, occupying, and taking portions of Ukraine, I think is a bit of a stretch. Politico also hit on this in a recent article where they said, barring extraordinary developments, post-conflict Russia, with or without Vladimir Putin at the helm, is most likely to be some recognizable version of its historical self. Authoritarian in domestic structure, expansionist in impulse, economically and technologically lagging, yet determined to play the role of a great power. That's right. That's what we expect from Russia. This is not a knock. That's just kind of the place that Russia's been for a long, long time. So why is there this idea that if Russia were to lose this war in Ukraine and Putin were to be ousted or somebody else were to come into power, then it would all of a sudden be drastically different than it's ever been in the past. That is probably what Russia will look like, with or without Putin, following the war in Ukraine. Again, looking at the idea of if Russia were to lose this war, it's probably going to look pretty similar, the political structure, however it shakes out, as it did prior to this war kicking off. The second one, shifting into the fear of collapse. Timothy Snyder put together some great clips recently kind of discussing this topic of Russia losing the war, and I'll play a little bit of that here.
It's really important not to think, oh, like Russia is so special and mystical and something. Like, it's an empire. Empires eventually overreach and they lose wars. That's a 200-year historical pattern. That Russia, I've said this before, but Russia's lost a lot of wars. Like, I assume that we're all pretty calm about Russia's defeat in 1856 and the Crimean War, right? We've all come to terms with that, right? We've all come to terms with Russia losing to Japan, 1905. That was okay, right? We're fine with that. Russia, Soviet Union lost to Afghanistan in 1979. I doubt that keeps anybody up at night, right? Big powers lose wars, it happens, and then they have to deal with it.
So kind of what he's hitting on is that countries lose wars and still survive, right? This is not a war of survival for Russia. I mean, look at the United States experience in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. We eventually, in every one of those situations, kind of dictated the terms and said, like, well, maybe now we've met our objectives and it's time for us to come home, or just left. And every one of those, we survived. We're still here. The United States still exists, arguably stronger now than we were before we started those conflicts. So, like, why is this all of a sudden different with Russia? Right? They're fighting a war outside of their territory. We argued a war of conquest, a war of expansionism, an imperial war. If they lose territory in Ukraine, the Russian Federation doesn't collapse. Where is that coming from, right? So why can't this same concept that is held true throughout history, that countries lose wars when they fight them not on their own territory, and then the country still survives, why is that going to be so different for Russia? And the answer is it probably won't be that drastically different. And then Politico kind of hammered on this, saying despite some Western pundits' breathless predictions, the chances of Russia's breaking up as a consequence of the war are negligible. Unlike the Soviet Union in its agony, Russia is held together by powerful centripetal forces, including patriotism and xenophobia, supply chains and critical infrastructure, not to mention the powerful security services that want to draw on the resources of the entire country. So again, there's just not a lot suggesting that a loss in this war would somehow trigger a collapse of the Russian Federation. That's not really in the works. There's not a movement for that to happen inside of Russia. So why would a war being fought on foreign soil all of a sudden trigger that? Again, the answer is it probably wouldn't. Chatham House also talked to this where they said fear of destabilizing Russia or even causing its breakup must not deter the West from pressing for a Ukrainian victory. To do otherwise is to protect Russia and Putin from the consequences of their own actions in Ukraine, and if anything, increase Russia's instability in the longer term. This in turn risks encouraging the view that Ukraine's victory is less important than the avoidance of a Russian defeat. And this is really kind of the heart and soul of this argument. The reason I wanted to address this, it's interesting when you think of how some of this is presented. Like, we need to be so concerned about this fragility of Russia. Like, don't rock the boat. You never know what could happen over there, right? Political instability, the country could collapse, or they could even fire off these nukes. Russia made the decision to invade Ukraine. So the idea that we're going to not do anything about it or really walk this tightrope because the fallout could be bad for them is crazy, right? Like, they made that decision. They put all of this on the line. They're probably, at the end of the day, in some way, shape, or form, going to have to deal with the consequences of that decision. And they also hit on a point here talking about how people are viewing Ukrainian victory less important than the avoidance of a Russian defeat. I think there's some solid arguments to be had there. And it doesn't have to get conspiratorial. You can just look at how U.S. aid has kind of been a slow trickle into Ukraine. Now, there are some very real reasons why, Abrams tanks were not in the first batch of equipment delivered to Ukraine. They didn't need tanks at the start of the invasion. They needed Stingers. They needed man-pads. They needed, javelins, in-laws, things like that. Man-portable, easily learned things to stop the Russian advance. They didn't need HIMARS day one. As the wars progressed, different weapon systems have come into the fold, but even then, it's been a relatively slow trickle to Ukraine. And there's, again, I think a very real argument to be had here that the Western focus, the U.S. focus, has been less on Ukrainian victory and more on preventing a Russian victory, if that makes sense. So long as Ukraine stays in the fight, it is viewed, in a sense, as kind of like a safe victory. And it's possible that part of that is coming out of this concern of what would happen. Would the world implode if Russia were to actually lose? And the answer is no. Again, Russia is not going to collapse from political instability. The country is not going to break apart. And now we're going to dive into the nuclear response, which again isn't really on the table when it comes to a Russian defeat in Ukraine. Quoting Viktor Andrusev, he said, quote, "Nothing now threatens the existence of the Russian state and its people, whereas recourse to nuclear weapons would threaten the very existence of Russia. The war is being fought exclusively on the territory of Ukraine." Now, you could argue, and I can see where this would come in, you could argue that, well, Russia has annexed portions of Ukraine now, so Zaporozhye, portions of the Donbass, Crimea are now legally Russian territory, so they have to defend those as though they were, Russian land, and that could mean using nuclear weapons. But I would say take it a step back from that real quick. Remember, nothing is automatic. There's people making these decisions. Do you really think that Putin, his leadership circles, the oligarchs, all of those people leading Russia, the most powerful people in Russia, are willing to risk their financial situation, which is good, their power, their families, their everything, their country, for the Donbass by firing off nuclear weapons? Really? Like they're all going to put that on the line to start a nuclear exchange over portions of Crimea? I don't think so. It doesn't seem like that's anywhere in the cards at all. And Chatham House hit on this as well, where they said Russia has also deliberately stoked fears of a nuclear response to defeat. But there are few circumstances in which defeat in the field in Ukraine could be construed as an existential threat to Russia itself or to the leadership elite, despite Putin's disingenuous presentation of the war as one of survival for Russian civilization. And there are even fewer grounds to suppose that the elite would wish to transform, this is key, survivable defeat into an existential threat by unleashing nuclear weapons. They say the more likely course borne out repeatedly throughout history is for Russia to swallow defeat and trade in what is negotiable to preserve what is essential. Again, we look at all of these talking points from Putin and some of the leaders inside of Russia talking about how the war in Ukraine is essential for Ukraine, for Russian survival. They have to fight this war for the future of the Russian Federation. But when you really get down to it, when you're talking about like actually making that decision of if you push that button, it could be the end of Russia, they're not pushing that button because this war really isn't existential. That's how it's being presented. But Russia would exist just fine today if they withdrew from Ukraine, right? Their survival was not on the line. Their future is not on the line because Ukraine was moving more towards the West, more towards NATO, more towards the United States. That was not threatening the existence of Russia, not at all. So the idea that anyone inside of that country would decide instead of, I like how they put this here, instead of swallowing defeat and trading in what is negotiable to preserve what is essential. Why are we looking at this as though Russian leaders are going to, across the board, make irrational decisions that we have not seen made throughout history? They could, and I need to leave that little room for error here, right? We have seen irrational behavior in the past by leaders throughout history. So that's entirely possible. But if we look at how history has played out, if we looked at how countries have responded to wars when they have lost them on foreign soil, and how they've adapted after the fact, by and large, countries, again, they trade in what is negotiable, step back, preserve their country, and preserve what is essential. It's hard to see why, unless you're looking into the very extremes that cannot be proven throughout history, it's hard to see why this case, Russia losing in Ukraine, would be all that drastically different. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix between a newsletter and a website. We put up written articles, audio articles. These videos go there, ad-free, sponsor-free. We cover a bunch of subjects from the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Russia, Ukraine, Mexico, and quite a bit more. Of course, if interested, that is all linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.